Okay, comrades, should we make a start? Welcome to Friday afternoon of Communist University. We're pleased to welcome Dr. Marc Mulholland from the University of Oxford. I did briefly look up on the internet last night, and it seems that Dr. Marc Mulholland has spoken at Communist University for 12 years now. 12 years, you don't get that for triple manslaughter. But he's gonna speak on the topic of class analysis and social transformation for about 50 minutes. It's a rather opaque title, but I'm sure he's gonna light it up like Thomas Edison for you. So, Marc, all yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you to CPGB talking about socialism and Prometheus, the conveners, for inviting me to talk to Communist University. As noted, I was given this title, it's quite widespread, so I'm going to be trying to address it at the general level at which it is pitched, but at various sidelights and particular points of, so it's not going to be completely capacious in that regard, but hopefully it'll allow for a very wide-ranging discussion. I thought I'd start with a bit of self-publicity, which is a couple of books I've coming out in September, a 2-at-1 go. There was a list went round the internet the other day talking about the jobs which are going to be made obsolete by AI. And top of the list is translators, and number 2 in the list was historians. So it seems wise to get these out whilst I've still got time. A different nature books. The first one, Letters from an Old Orange Man, is in fact mostly articles which I found which have been republished with annotations by myself, giving a chapter and verse. Literally, there's a lot of scriptural references and an introduction. The guy who wrote it anonymously, Letters from an Old Orange Man, in 1835, at a point when it seemed that the Orange Order was about to be closed down, indeed was banned for a period, not least because it is involved in the conspiracy to prevent Queen Victoria coming to the throne because she's too much of a liberal. Not something you see in the Orange Order website these days. It was effectively closed down, but then revived with the covert support of the British government in the 1840s. As a counter-revolutionary mobilization. But it's very interesting. It looks at the Orange Order in the first few decades of its existence, from the 1790s to the mid-1830s. It's a defense, and a lot of the defense is kind of religious, scriptural, and kind of the prejudices one might expect. But it's also written by a bloke who had grown up during the 18th century Enlightenment, and it's quite clever in many respects. It's a clever reactionary argument. And one argument it makes against the Tory establishment is the necessity of popular organizations of the radical right, and how the Orange Order is a popular organization of the radical right, which should be supported. Old Orange Man says there is a natural tendency for the great mass of people at the bottom of the social pile, the masses, to gravitate towards such combinations as are unconstitutional. The love of order and social distinctions are not feelings or sentiments to which men are naturally prone. The Orange Order was therefore a necessary bulwark precisely because conservative feelings and principles are, as it were, hotbed plants which require to be cherished, whilst radical opinions resemble weeds which require to be repressed. Now, he's maybe being excessively pessimistic, from our perspective, excessively optimistic, but it's a point worth making, actually. The importance of organization and intervention from above in the movement, in the popular movements, in order to twist and bend in some ways. In that respect, you can never look at a class movement in some kind of crystalline purity, whether it's a proletarian class movement or any other class movement. It's always within a force field of struggle, and one moreover which has always been interpolated by hostile class forces which are seeking to bend popular movements, popular opinions to their will. The other book is a book about class struggle, about the Irish peasantry. It's a very big book, which I've been working on for a number of years. And there's quite a lot written about the Irish land movement, but of a very particular type. The way I have summarised it is that the Irish peasantry tends to be looked upon by historians as mugs, thugs, and lugs. Mugs because they're always being manipulated by various elites. Thugs because they're always beating each other up and intimidating each other. Lugs because they're ignorant, full of superstition and so on. And this really is the caricature which, at least since the 1970s, has presented a radically de-romanticised, but in fact largely, I think, inaccurate view of the Irish peasantry. Donald McCracken, in a recent book, for example, has talked about the quasi-mafioso nature of rural Irish society and explains it in terms of peasant psychosis, primeval ritual, and the simple rural pastime of intimidating one's neighbours. Miles Dungan has done a kind of recent book, kind of a true crime version of the Irish land question, which refers to violent frenzy, mayhem, fratricidal violence, and the pettiness, homicidal malice, and malevolent envy that plagued rural Ireland. And this is pretty characteristic of how the Irish peasantry has been seen, at least since the 1970s. In part, maybe because of the Troubles, but actually more, I think, because of Ireland moving into a new form of bourgeois modernity and a certain scorn and contempt, the enormous condescension of posterity on its recent past. The general view in this historiography, this is where class comes in, is kind of curious. It's a kind of a reactionary Marxism or neoconservative Marxism. Sometimes literal. One of the major historians of the Irish peasantry is Paul Bew, who was associated back in the day with the Workers' Party in Northern Ireland. He's now Lord Bew, who sits as a crossbencher, he's really a Tory. But even those who have never identified in any political or even generalised sense with Marxism have used a Marxian framework in attempts to understand the Irish peasantry, but in a particular way, to present the Irish peasantry as, in essence, radically divided, ineffective in its own cause, and mass politics being a delusion. So to give the general view, before the Irish famine of the 1840s, the peasantry is seen as being radically divided between farmers on the one hand, agricultural labourers on the other, both fighting with each other, the landlords kind of floating somewhere above. The famine is seen as a natural disaster. Fundamentally, it's a conflict insofar as it's a social conflict between the farmers who survive and the labourers who die. Post-famine, you have the emergence of a farming bourgeoisie, which then in the Irish Land War of the 1880s dominates the smaller peasantry, kind of inveigles them into a struggle in which the only really real victors are the graziers and the large farmers. I think almost all of this is wrong. It begins with an inaccurate premise, which is that Irish rural society is like British rural society. That is, British rural society is landlords who provide working farms, as fully equipped farms, to tenants who hire them as capital and put that capital to work by employing wage worker labourers to run those farms. It's the famous Trinity formula, which Marx and indeed all political economists talk about in the 19th century, of rent for the landlord, of profit for the capitalist farmer, of wages for the agricultural labourer. It just doesn't apply to Ireland in the 19th century. The landlord does not provide fully stocked farms, does not provide buildings, does not provide anything in Ireland except for bare land. The landlord is entirely a rent receiver and nothing else. There's no role in production, which is significant. Agricultural production is fundamentally based upon the small farm. There's quite a lot of wage working labour, but it's mostly younger sons bringing in wages, bringing it back to the family farm and so on. And this actually remains pretty constant across most of the 19th century. Throughout the 19th century, the small farmer dominates, that is, the peasantry dominates. Before the famine, the main social conflict is not between farmers and agricultural labourers, it's between the peasantry and the landlords. And we can see this in the mode of struggle and the targeting of struggle by the very, very militant peasant movement in Ireland, which takes the form of lots and lots of secret leagues, kind of agricultural, militant, vigilante / trade union groups, which I call the Bucheli, or the boys, because that's what peasants call them, as a generic term. The famine is not primarily a conflict between the agricultural labour and the small farmer. It's a conflict, and it is a conflict, very one-sided conflict, between the peasantry and the landed elite and the landlord state. Nobody's done the calculation before, but I calculate that at the beginning of the famine, the landlords took about 28% of our agricultural produce in the form of rent out of the Irish economy. By the end of the famine, that's gone up to 36%. In absolute terms, taxation goes up in Ireland during the famine. Taxation does not go upon income, does not go upon landlord wealth. It goes upon common consumer. It goes up in absolute terms. I kind of calculate that during the famine, about 50% of agricultural produce is taken out of Ireland or taken out of the peasantry in one way or another through rent or taxation, which is a higher percentage than that taken out of the peasantry during, for example, the collectivization famine in the Ukraine or the Great Leap Forward famine in China. So the famine is a class struggle against the peasantry with the intention of restructuring the peasantry, amongst other things. Post-famine, we have a reckoning. We have not just a major class struggle. We have a class revolution in Ireland, focused in the early 1879 to 1882, the Land War, as it's known, which is a militant struggle against landlordism, which is ultimately successful. It overthrows landlordism. It is a peasant movement. It's a peasant movement. It's not a movement of the large graziers. The 1881 Land Act, which is a key stage which marks the movement towards the victory of the peasantry in Ireland, explicitly excludes the graziers from that measure. So the Land League is a peasant movement, and the Land Revolution is a peasant revolution, which is successful. I think this is one of the reasons why people have not looked upon it this way, because people are very uncomfortable, or professional historians are very uncomfortable with successful class movements, successful class revolutions, but this is one. And people are uncomfortable too with the kind of society it produces, excessively so, I should say. By the small farmer Ireland by the 1960s is able to provide the highest level of calorie intake in the world. In fact, there's only 9 countries in the world in 1960 which can provide each member of society with a minimum of 3,000 calories a day, and Ireland is one of them. This is 100 years after the famine. So Ireland is a successful class revolution, and it's a revolution of the peasantry. The peasantry is internally structured. It's got a very significant artisanal element, which relates and angles. It's got a proletarian element, but it does have a structure and dominance. And the structure and dominance is the smallholding peasantry. And I think in general, this is a useful way to think about class. Any class is complicated, but it's got a structure and dominance. It's got an element which is demarcates, focuses, achieves hegemony over the various class assemblage, which defines the class as such. And of course, this moves about over time, but has a unity over time too. because in the end, we're not talking about something which is straightforwardly numeric or even algebraic, but it's something which is about dominance and an internal class coalition. We should consider class, I think, as a field of force. Now, switching at last, says you, to the proletariat, and indeed how socialism dealt with it. I think it's worth beginning with the kind of early 19th century notions of ideology of socialism and communism. Communism as a popular movement, as a movement with significant, not overwhelming, but significant popular element, it begins as a wing of what's known at the time as democracy or republicanism. And that in turn is a wing, if you like, of a kind of liberal radicalism. And democracy or republicanism is in essence looking for not capitalism, but a form of widely distributed small-scale property, which for many people is considered to be the pretty imminent post-capitalist future. Not least, this is really what had been anticipated by this guy, Adam Smith. Adam Smith really sees capitalism as the stage through which society is moving, a stage which once a country has acquired its full complement of riches, you're going to have a scaling down of the level of profitability. The ordinary rate of profit will be very small because of the competitive process. It'll make it impossible simply to live off profits itself. Everybody instead will get involved in relatively small-scale production. All the people of small or middling fortunes will be obliged to superintend themselves the employment of their own stocks. It'll be necessary for almost every man to be a man of business or engage in some sort of trade. So what Adam Smith expects in the 18th century is that this period of massive concentration of capital, a very rich capitalist living off rent, or living off profits, is only a passing phase towards the general democratization of property. And this is an appealing idea to the democracy or republicanism in the 19th century. This is seen to be a near and imminent future, the democratization of property. And in some respects, the radical left wing of this, out of which socialism emerges, is also in dialogue with this notion of the radical democratization of property. Social democracy, as is often described, or social republicanism in the first half of the 19th century, is trying to address the problem of small-scale artisanal property, which has come under the cost of factory competition, most dramatically in the handloom weavers, who have been, relatively speaking, very well paid, a kind of a vanguard of the popular movement, often very well educated, which is then reduced to absolute penury by factory competition in the first half of the 19th century, not least in Britain, but certainly not only in Britain. The aim of social republicanism is to do something about this. So social democracy or social republicanism agrees with the broader democratic or republican tradition that there should be a widespread distribution of property, that the social democratic or social republican tradition says that it'll be necessary for small-scale property to be organized cooperatively if it is to sustain its independence against large-scale factory production. The idea of the cooperative workshop and mutuality was to re-establish artisanal small-scale workshop property on secure foundations. The aim, therefore, was to avoid proletarianization. Now, factories weren't going to disappear, and generally when people thought about, for example, taking factories into state ownership, the idea was to limit their corrosive effect on artisanal production, to remoralize their workforces, and maybe to a degree to soak up the pauperized. It was in effect secondary to the more important aim, which was to develop the cooperative workshop. A pretty good example of a theorist along these lines who's not talked about much now is Thomas Hodgkin. In many respects, Hodgkin develops a form of socialism of the artisanal ideal. Wage earners would escape from dependence by establishing themselves as small property owners, sustaining them free exchange with each other without having to carry the burden of an unearned profit creamed off by capitalists, monopolizing the means of production and credit. For Hodgkin, there's no role of the state. There's no role for the state in all of this. And in fact, Hodgkin is hostile to state control. In later life, he ends up being an editor, one of the editors of The Economist in Britain. But he never gives up this idea of the social republican ideal of the cooperative independent workshop, engaging with other workshops on the basis of mutuality rather than going through the capitalist middleman. We can see similar ideas in all kinds of utopian socialists, as we often call them now, Sismondi, Louis Blanc, and so on. Marx and Engels, therefore, in some respects, is closest to the French thinker or activist, better speaking, Auguste Blanqui, because Blanqui doesn't really talk about what communism or socialism would look like. He talks about the technique of revolution. The Marx-Engels party were unusual, relatively unusual at least, in seeing the factory proletariat as a central agency and mass production as the model for the future. June 1847, Engels drafted a Communist Confession of Faith, which prefigures the Communist Manifesto, in question and answer format. It begins, interestingly, with the premise that all individuals strive to be happy and that the happiness of individuals is inseparable from the happiness of all, which is an assumption about human nature. Though Marx and Engels often say not to have a theory of human nature. This could only be realized by overcoming the alienation of the individual from the community, which this in turn would happen through the replacement of individual private property with community of property. The proletariat was defined as that class of society which lives exclusively by its labour and which was exposed to the fluctuations of competition. Engels dates the modern proletariat from the introduction of machinery from about 1750, 1760. The handicraftsman, the artisan, had been at most a temporary proletarian whose ambition was to acquire capital and employ labourers. The revolutionary aim of communists, the Marx-Engels kind of tendency, was to establish the political liberation of the proletariat through a democratic constitution, which is the first fundamental condition for the introduction of community of property. Communists would proceed by enlightening and uniting the proletariat. They rejected conspiratorial organization and were aware that revolutions are not made deliberately and arbitrarily. Due to the opposition of the possessing classes, however, the proletariat is likely to be driven into a revolution. In that case, communists would defend the cause of the proletariat just as well by our deeds as now by our words. Marx and Engels are very influenced, obviously, by the Chartist context, where textile factory towns were notably advanced. This isn't terribly typical across the radical movement in Europe. And even discussed in the early 1850s, Marx and Engels still thought that the factory proletariat were at least 5, 10, 15, 20 years behind the petty bourgeoisie, the artisans, when it came to political consciousness. The first International Working Men's Association, the First International, saw debates which overlaps with these ideas of social republicanism, social democracy. Debates over cooperatives, land nationalisation, and so on, which reflected its combined proletarian and artisanal base. Marx and Engels' priority is to hold all of this together, I think. Ferdinand Lassalle in Germany broke violently with liberalism, though it's notably the model of socialism he proposed was still strongly small shop cooperative. The Liebknecht-Bebel wing of German social democracy developed out of the Deutsche Volkspartei, which was very much in this social republican, older social democratic tradition. It argued for the arguing for the democratization of property. The immediate program of the Deutsche Volkspartei, abolition of all taxation on the working classes, radical democratization, and the development of worker cooperatives, the democratization of property. This minimum program, much of it is brought over directly into German social democracy as it developed, into both the Gotha and then the Erfurt program, though with the steady downplaying of the significance of cooperative production. Much emphasis on the income tax. It's worth bearing in mind that just how radical actually the minimum program demands in taxation are. Because you tend to think, oh, well, you know, calling for income tax, that's no big deal, you know. Income tax applies to about 1 to 3% of the population. Income tax is not the way we understand income tax. It's not on wages. It's basically on unearned income coming from a ownership of property. It's based upon rents. It's based upon profits, almost exclusively in the 19th century. So you're saying no indirect taxes. You're basically saying the working classes will pay no taxes, and the rich will pay all the taxes, but the state will be radically democratized. So the rich will be forced out of the state apparatus, which they will then be required to pay for. The aim of this, however, whether you see it in social republican terms or indeed in communist terms, is to progressively confiscate the rich. It's not to mulch them in perpetuity. It's the idea, it's a process of confiscation. It's interesting looking at the famous 1881, is it 1881 or 1880? The program, this bit written by Marx himself, along with Jules Gouret, of the program of the Parti Ouvrière. What's kind of interesting about it is how he talks about freedom in two equivalent registers. There's two ways the producers can be free. One is owning the means of production yourself. One is being an artisan. One is being a small farmer. One is being a shopkeeper. That is a form of freedom. The other form is collective. The implication, actually, the Parti Ouvrière is that most people will prefer individual small property ownership. It's only when you can no longer do that that you'll take the route of collective ownership of the means of production as the only way to secure the independent ownership of your own labour power. There's quite a lot of truth to this if you kind of look at the stats about. I mean, it's very striking in some respects. You see these little shops and so on, you know, opening up on the high street and then closing 3 months later or something like that. You think, why do people do that? You know, why do you take all the stress? People like to be their own boss. Probably why also the far left tends to split quite a lot. People like to be their own boss. You know, so I think the Parti Ouvrière program is getting at something. The idea of not being somebody else's boss is a significant driver of the notion of freedom. The argument is that capitalism, however, means that this can only be done through a democratic collective control of the means of production, simply because the means of production are massified to the point and are operated in common that they can no longer be divided up into small-scale property ownership. In that sense, older social republicanism, the argument here, is becoming irrelevant. Interesting, though, there's still overlaps. 1885, Wilhelm Liebknecht, one of the leaders of the SPD, proposes puts forward what he calls the settlement program. He says, look, what we should demand of the German government is that they give us 4 to 5 million marks every year, or they give the workers 4 to 5 million marks every year as a grant, not as a loan, which will then be used to set up worker cooperatives. Land and state enterprises should then be leased to these worker cooperatives instead of to capitalists. And indeed, the worker cooperatives should come first in the line for these when they're leased out, given preference in public contracts. And the argument is that with union rights, these worker cooperatives must lead gradually to a transition to the total production into totally cooperative production. Now, this is opposed by Bebel and Bernstein as being on a whole number of grounds, but it comes directly, the proposal comes directly from Engels. So Engels actually says to Liebknecht he should do this. So it's an interesting thing to think about for a minimum program, because one of the demands of the minimum program, give us loads of money to set up cooperatives. It does indicate, however, the overlap which continues between the older social republican notion of the democratization of property and the communist notion of the collective ownership of the main means of production, distribution, and exchange. Now, as I've indicated, the first half of the 19th century, really the vanguard of the social republican and indeed to a large extent the socialist movement had been the small workshop artisan. It wasn't the factory worker. These are the radicals for the first half and going into the second half of the 19th century. They are radical precisely because they feel they're going to be crushed by capitalist competition. But something begins to change from the middle of the 19th century. And one thing which is changing is the idea that actually large-scale capitalist production does not necessarily destroy small-scale petty production. In fact, large-scale capitalist production will crush elements of small-scale production, but will give new lifeblood to other departments of small-scale capitalist production or small-scale petty bourgeois production. To give an example, is the famous Great Exhibition of 1851, is it? Where they built Crystal Palace in London. And it's a huge exhibition which is focused upon the mighty products of the Industrial Revolution so far. And they built this huge palace made out of steel and glass. It's a product of industrial high modernity in 1851. It's absolutely enormous. It includes 300,000 panes of glass. But it's worth noting that each one of these panes of glass was blown by hand. It's blown in a small workshop, same as the Crystal Fountain, which is the most attractive central kind of display in the Crystal Palace. Most of the manufacturers on display in the machinery court had actually been assembled from handmade components. An awful lot of large-scale industrial production actually relied upon and continues to rely upon small-scale workshop production. Large-scale industry, it turns out, yes, it does destroy the hand-loom weaver, but it doesn't destroy, in fact, it gives new lifeblood to many other departments, whether it be in engineering, whether it be in retail and distribution, whether it be in the small-scale market gardener, farmer. It gives new life to petty bourgeois production. Petty bourgeois production, artisanal production doesn't disappear. And this becomes, I think, particularly evident with second wave industrialization from about 1870. It became increasingly evident that large-scale industry tended to maintain, even to expand petty production, because the servicing required because of machine tooling workshops, because of retail outlets. The result of this is that you get large sections of the petty bourgeoisie who stop thinking that capitalism is an absolute threat to the means of existence and begin to think instead that there are important aspects of capitalism which are friendly to their interests. And the result is a substantial amount of the petty bourgeoisie, which had been in the radical democratic vanguard, moves to the radical right by the 1880s and 1890s. They're still seeking to protect their small-scale property, but the broad democratic alliance is sundered, the proletarian wing breaks loose, and the large sections of the petty bourgeoisie moved to the radical right. There's exceptions to this. One exception important is in the United Kingdom. We tend to forget that the United Kingdom has got a proletarian movement in Great Britain, which is in a de facto alliance, actually, with the Irish peasant movement, which is the basis for radical liberalism into the 20th century. We also see a democratic alliance between the peasantry and the proletariat in Russia, for example. But in much of Central Europe, there's a radical divide between the petty bourgeoisie and the proletarian movement by the 1880s and the 1890s. Karl Kautsky talks about the new reactionary democracy. The old radical democracy has turned into the reactionary democracy, which is opposed now to the interests of the proletariat. Indeed, social democracy has no more bitter enemy, Kautsky says, than the reactionary democracy. We can see something of the ideology of the, this is just an indication of the spread, the continuation of small-scale petty production within an environment of large-scale capitalist production. Kropotkin, quite rightly in many respects, makes a lot of this. This is how Kropotkin describes modernity. He describes it as the continuation of factories, but also fields and workshops. Factories does not eliminate the fields, it does not eliminate the workshops. This is the ideology, in one regard, of the reactionary democracy, quite nicely summed up by Rerum Novarum, which is a papal encyclical on the labour question, produced by the Catholic Church in 1891, which is a very interesting document, based upon natural law. When a man engages in labour, the very reason and motive is to obtain property. For every man has by his nature the right to possess property as his own. Private property ownership is therefore according to natural law. But this is essentially a small-scale property ideal. It's also a patriarchal ideal in the literal sense. The right of property must also belong to a man is meant as man, in his capacity of head of a family. For it is the most sacred law of nature that a father must provide food and all necessary for those whom he has begotten, for his kids. Within this context, Rerum Novarum says it's fair for people to join trade unions. It's fair for people to go on strike because they're protecting the small-scale property of their labour. It's also fair to be critical of large-scale capitalism when it impinges on small-scale property. So Rerum Novarum is capable of being critical of capitalism, as indeed the papacy still is. But it's a petty bourgeois ideal, a patriarchal petty bourgeois ideal. Another version of this, a less intellectual, well, usually less intellectual, of course, is anti-Semitism, which is another important aspect of the reactionary democracy at this time. You get good capitalists who, in essence, are producerists who provide job lots for the small-scale petty producer. And you get bad capitalists on the one level, those asset strippers who will crush small-scale petty production. On the other hand, those rivals in petty production, the sweated industries. Of course, bad capitalists are defined as Jewish capitalism. Good capitalists are designed as non-Jewish capitalism. This is the socialism of fools, as Bebel famously describes it. So it's a reactionary anti-capitalism. Now, so we have a resiling away from radicalism, or at least left-wing radicalism, by a radical republicanism into the reactionary democracy. This is one of the reasons I think we need to be a bit cautious about kind of current ultra-valorization of the democratic republican tradition, or the republican tradition in 19th century Europe. We have to see where a lot of it ends up, particularly in Central Europe. A lot of it ends up very distant, but sociologically on the same line of petty bourgeois politics. What is also happening in the late 19th century, of course, is the organization of the large-scale proletariat. most notably in the trade unions. We're probably used to thinking now about how the trade unions at the end of the 19th century only organise a minority of the working class, and they're limited in all sorts of ways. All of that's true. On the other hand, the other thing you have to remember about the trade unions is that they are easily the largest permanent organisations produced from below ever in European history to this point. They are mass organisations which are almost entirely proletarian. If you look at the socialist parties, you find all number of kind of bourgeois intellectuals and lecturers and so on coming into the movement. You don't in trade unions. Trade unions from top to bottom are proletarian, and they self-organise, and they are very large scale, and they are dynamic. And this has a huge impact, and you add on to this cooperatives and so on. There is actually the spontaneous emergence of a modern large-scale proletarian movement, which is really quite radically distinct from the older social republican tradition. This is another reason why you have a bifurcation of older social republicanism into the modern social democratic or communist movement on the one hand, and an increasingly right-wing petty bourgeois politics on the other. This movement also is able to punch in some respects above its weight because it tends to be urban and concentrated. Not least, it punches above its weight in electoral terms because you tend to have very dense proletarian concentrations, which means particularly in the first past the post system, you can win seats, because you get very, very strong urban concentrations. Now, if you look at the early 19th century, the barricade insurrection had been the basis of the revolutionary democratic mobilization. I think in the later 19th century, urban class concentration is more likely to produce a kind of politics based upon electoral mobilization, mass demonstration, and the mass strike. This becomes the basis of what Kautsky describes as the strategy of attrition. Now, if we look at the Second International, there tends to be a way of looking at socialism which is a very well organized and disciplined factory proletariat at its core, which is a bit which if nothing else knows discipline. It's quite distant in some respects from the way Marx tended to think of the evolution, I think, of the proletariat, which Marx tended to think of it, I think, in somewhat more dynamic terms. It's just a quote here about the cooperative, the collective labour, and it's really a kind of discussion of how the proletariat evolves over time. It's no longer necessary for you to do manual labour yourself. Enough if you are an organ of the collective labourer and perform one of its subordinate functions. The first definition of productive labour still remains correct for the collective labourer considered as a whole, but no longer holds good for each member taken individually. What he's driving at there is that the proletariat should no longer be seen simply as an assemblage of individuals who are bashing metal with big hammers, but an integrated production process in which there's a combination at the networked level of manual and various degrees of intellectual labour. Second International tends not to think about the working class in these terms. They tend to think of by hand on the one hand, by head on the other. Basically, a manual proletariat which will drive towards revolution. Thereafter will be the basis of production, but will be directed, if you like, by the head, will be directed by a managerial elite. Okay. So the Second International is inclined to think in terms of massified production under state direction. This is developed in some respects most strongly in Fabian Britain, but also in Britain meets its sharpest kind of intellectual challenge, organizational challenge in the form of guild socialism, which is in some respects an attempt in modern conditions to recreate the notion of the cooperative workshop. People like G.D.H. Cole and another bloke who I'm interested in, Samuel George Hobson, partly because he's from Bessbrook in Ulster. He's one of the major theorists of guild socialism. He's also a cousin of Bulmer Hobson, who reorganizes Fenianism in the years before 1916 in Ireland. Now, it's in the period of the Second International that pressure comes on the idea of the proletariat as an emancipatory class, and it comes from various directions. Partly it comes from the criminologists in Italy, people like Lombroso, Berry, Sigli, the psychologists of France, Taine and Gustave Le Bon, and the Fabians in Britain, the socialism of superior brains, socialists of Britain, tendencies which look upon the masses as being incapable of self-organization and prone to riotous outbreak. And Bernstein fundamentally is making that argument that Bernstein's making the argument that the proletariat basically needs the direction of the liberal bourgeoisie because it's incapable of acting as a hegemonic class in its own right. It just doesn't have the education. And if you take away all the fancy stuff from Bernstein, that's what he's saying. To some extent, actually, the centre, the kind of orthodox centre in German social democracy agrees with this analysis that the proletariat lacks necessary education and self-belief. For this reason, they argue that you actually have to maintain a strict class independence of the party, because if you let the bourgeoisie into the party, the bourgeoisie will end up dominating it because the proletariat are easily dominated. In France, Jean Jaurès is more optimistic. He feels that the French proletariat were sufficiently strong that they could enter into broader social alliances without being overcome. Now that the working class had developed its own unions, cooperatives, and political agitation, Jaurès regarded the modern proletariat as an autonomous power which can cooperate with other powers, which is never absorbed by them, which always keeps its own special character for its separate and superior task. Jean Jaurès, though he's a reformist in many respects, doesn't identify himself really with Bernsteinian revisionism, and describes his own program as one of revolutionary evolution. I think it's part of the difference is that in France, you continue to have quite a genuinely radical democratic petty bourgeois movement. Now, the revisionist debate, yeah, well, I think that's just because we're going to stay for a bit, so can't ignore him. During the Second International, the failure of a very large British proletariat to produce a commensurately powerful socialist current was a cause of considerable concern. And to a large extent, this was ascribed to the jingoism of imperialism, again, this tendency for the proletariat to be dominated ideologically. Colonialism was ascribed rather doubtfully, I think, or described rather doubtfully as the export of capital. This made it easier to argue with workers that imperialism was simply diverting resources that otherwise could go into wages and job creation. If imperialism is about the export of capital, then you can argue with workers, well, the capital should be staying here and going into your wages and going into your work, shouldn't be going to Africa. Anarchism at this period generally rejected the emphasis on the proletariat as such. However, an offshoot of anarchism, anarcho-syndicalism, in attacking parliamentary cretinism, looked to the revolutionary general strike and did indeed see the proletarian trade unions as the organizing centers of the future socialist state and society. Syndicalism appealed to the unskilled and those workers who anarcho-syndicalism tended to appeal to unskilled workers, but also those workers who to a large extent managed themselves without much assistance from the owners of capital, miners, for example. Georges Sorel idealized the engineer, because the engineering workshop pretty much managed itself amongst the workers. Now, the 1905 revolution in Russia brought a focus onto the proletarian mode of struggle. The political mass strike, which broke out in 1905, though the Bolsheviks did attempt a more traditional insurrection. And the political mass strike animated widespread discussion in the Second International. Rosa Luxemburg, in particular, thought that the spontaneously developing mass strike could shock the Workers' Party out of its developing conservatism. When Bernstein attacked breakdown theory, as he described it, socialists looked in vain for compelling theories of capitalism's internal limits. Hilferding's finance capital argued actually that competition had been displaced to the interstate level, so that the implication breakdown would happen not through depression, but rather through the form of interstate competition and therefore world war. War duly broke out in 1914, though not really over any colonial question. As we know, the Second International collapses. Lenin now develops the imperialism theory to assert that a section of the working class had actually been bought off and thereby had become, by imperialist super profits, and thereby had become the principal constituency behind social chauvinism and the workers' movement. Revisionism, in this view, was no longer a vulgar error, but rather the expression of a class fraction that had literally gone over to the side of the bourgeoisie. It's pretty unlikely because the so-called labour aristocracy, the more skilled element of the working class, tends, if anything, to be on the left of the movement rather than on the right. The 1917 revolution was, worth bearing in mind, is carried out by a peasant proletarian class alliance. The idea was, and the Leninist idea is, that the gentry military class would be swept away, but the capitalist class would be kind of kept in place, under the discipline of the armed proletariat organized in Soviets, but kept in place in order to organize production. Splits in the Revolutionary Alliance and Entente intervention allowed the military gentry class to strike back, therefore the civil war in Russia. A communist regime survives because it has got a good deal of peasant sympathy, as well as having internal lines of communication and control of the cities. Lenin's model effectively had been one of state capitalism, that in essence you have proletarian state power, but you maintain for a considerable period of time a more or less kind of quasi-capitalist economy. This had collapsed into war communism, but it's kind of revived with the new economic policy in the 1920s. Lenin clearly sees new economic policy as quite a long-term, a transitional stage. However, the cities to a large extent have been deproletarianized during the Civil War, and there's a tendency towards the very rapid elaboration of a petty bourgeois business class in the years of new economic policy. The left and then the united opposition of the Communist Party were anxious to rebuild the proletarian constituency. The right and centre of the Communist Party, the communist regime, opposed pumping over from the peasantry for fear of shattering the Smaika, the proletarian peasant class alliance. However, a threat of war with Britain meant that the state, from about 1927, starts making grain seizures. The peasantry respond with a production strike. The state strikes back with collectivization and forced industrialization. If we're looking at the broad picture, we've seen a big proletarian upsurge at the end of the First World War. We could maybe come back to that. But one thing is worth kind of pointing out that by about 1914, the urban manual working class maxes out at about 40% of the population, and it remains there until about the 1950s. So we have a long period where, in fact, kind of proletarian socialism is really going to be short of an electoral mandate, any likely electoral mandate to bring about socialism. And this remains a fundamental problem for the socialist movement in the interwar period. nonetheless, it's strong enough to encourage petty bourgeois flight to the radical right and a capitalist interest in the crushing of the proletarian movement. And part of the price of doing that is the crushing of democracy as such. In some circumstances, there is a proletarian petty bourgeois alliance in defense of democratic structures. To a degree, we see this in New Deal America. We see it in the Nordic countries. We see it probably in medieval Ireland. We see it in Mexico of Lázaro Cárdenas and other places. In other places, democracy tends to be collapsing. Social democracy, to a large extent, is smashed by the time you get the outbreak of the Second World War. But after a gap, social democracy is restructured, partly under a CIA aegis at the end of the Second World War, in order to effect a new class compromise. The post-war boom is largely predicated on the revival of proletarianization. You begin to get the proletarianization of the workforce, which had flatlined, begins to take off again, and the de-peasantization of Western societies. Because of this, of the 1970s, something like real socialism is again looking like a prospect. A radical advance of the collective worker, the collective labourer in the Marxian sense, was already apparent, and much more is in the offing with the development of information technology and the disintegration of the old kind of totalitarian modernizing model. The collective labourer is most evident in services, which have become the predominant sector in terms of employment. So we have immaterial labour, the melding of handwork and brain work, what Hart and Negri refer to as the multitude, which produces cooperation, communication, forms of life and social relationships as a model for political decision making. This isn't very attractive to the capitalists. So mass unemployment is used to discipline the workforce in the 1970s and going into the 1980s, and much industrial production is diminished and offshored. Overt unemployment is rather too obviously an indictment of capitalism. To a degree, by the time you get to the 1990s, services becomes a sink of the reserve army of labour. It's kind of suitable for that because it's very hard to measure productivity in services. David Graeber's talks about bullshit jobs, for example. Services sees relatively low fixed capital costs. Combine that with tax breaks and income support for employing, feminisation of the workforce, disappearance of the family wage, part-time and on-off working, to some extent is absorbing the reserve army of labour into the employed workforce, as opposed to having it demarcated from the employed workforce, something which serves to undermine the organisational capacities of the employed workforce. China, meanwhile, to some extent has kind of shifted to something which looks a little bit like the Leninist notion of state capitalism. I say a little bit. An abandonment of kind of totalitarianism without handing the bourgeoisie significant political power. Something which is kind of notable in Chinese culture and is the notion of luan, or chaos, which is very meaningful to those who possess property in China, because a lot of these people, their mums and their dads who have been caught up in the Cultural Revolution, they know what it's like to have the masses being chucked at you. So the state is able to use the threat of the masses in a kind of rather indirect way, and more directly the threat of purging, to keep the bourgeoisie in line, to keep it subordinated to state interests in China. And state interests have this developmental model, which has so far been pretty successful. In China, the bourgeois mouths are stuffed with gold, whilst rising standard of living of peasant workers and a serious attempt to develop the collective worker, which is going on in China, means that the social dynamic remains on the positive side of the ledger from the point of view of the regime there. I think I might leave that there because I've raised a lot of issues and I know I've gone over time now. So I drop there.